Hello, I'm Richard Toy, and with me is Professor James Mark. I'm going to be talking to him about his current research project, which is called Socialism Goes Global: Cold War Connections Between the Second and Third Worlds. Now, often we maybe discuss these topics of the Cold War and issues of decolonisation in separate compartments, if you like. What is the relevance of the Cold War to the study of empire?
I think you're right to highlight that traditionally historians have been rather divided into different camps, whether they've looked at empire or Cold War on the other, but people are starting to bring those together now. Imperialism as a concept is of course important to the legitimacy of different sides in the Cold War. On one hand, you see in the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe this claim that we're the great anti-imperialists. We're the ones who fight against or support fights against the British or French empires, and then US imperialism after that. And of course they do much to support these movements. On the other hand, in the West, you find accusations, of course, that the Soviets are the real imperialists rather than us. An interesting example around the time of the Suez Crisis in summer 1956, when Anthony Eden is asked about whether the British are still a great imperial power. He responds by saying, well, actually, look, who has gained the most territory since the Second World War? It's not us, it's the Soviets in Eastern Europe. So there's sort of contestations for legitimacy between different sides in the Cold War based around claims of being being the greater anti-imperialists or less imperialist than others. I think also actually that the moment of decolonisation, the breakdown of empires, also is a moment when the world opens up to be remade, but very much in the context of Cold War competition. So vast swathes of the world now seem open to influence from different sides. Will they become capitalist? Will they become communist? And this is, of course, a source of great competition for many decades up until the end of the Cold War.
And I suppose that does flag up an important point about the changing nature of the Cold War, actually. I mean, particularly the death of Stalin in 1953 sort of maybe marks some kind of sea change. But to ask more about your project, which focuses to a considerable extent on Eastern Europe, as the Cold War carries on, but also as the decolonisation process begins to accelerate, what impact does that decolonisation have in Eastern Europe? How is it discussed?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is they do not call it decolonisation. I think in many Western countries, decolonisation has become a naturalised term, a term we simply think describes in a neutral form a process that went on as European empires collapsed. But in other parts of the world, this is not the case. Decolonisation as a term is seen as a Western invention. It's a term which is used to suggest that power is handed over generously from the coloniser to the colonised, and suggests that it's a smooth political process. And you have criticisms, particularly from the Eastern Bloc, that this kind of term denies agency to those who've struggled for independence, and of course denies or marginalises the violence that often went alongside it. So in the Soviet bloc, it wouldn't be called decolonisation, it would be called the anti-imperialist struggle. And it was an anti-imperialist struggle that we have a responsibility to support. So this is why the Soviets go out and give financial support to build the Aswan Dam in Egypt, why doctors from the GDR go out across Africa and Latin America to support hospital building projects in progressive or socialist countries. It's why there's military support for conflicts across the world. But it's also a struggle that has to be supported at home. So in many communist states, you'll find anti-imperialist solidarity movements set up. So solidarity with Vietnam, solidarity with Chile after the overthrow of Allende, and so on. And so citizens were being encouraged, for example, to give blood to help the North Vietnamese fighters, or to work extra shifts and donate their wages. So there's an attempt to encourage solidarity between people.
Yes, you use this word encourage. Now, I mean, of course, we know that these were very repressive regimes, of course. And so, in a sense, these movements that you're talking about, I mean, how much were they simply an artifact of sort of totalitarian control, propaganda and manipulation, or was there in fact, in spite of that sort of repressive state, was there in fact genuine support for the so-called sort of anti-imperial struggle?
Mm-hmm. Yes, they still remained repressive states in some way, but of course much less repressive than they had been in the Stalinist period, and a certain latitude given to freedom of expression within certain limits. Having said that, unlike Western anti-imperialist movements, I mean, you think of anti-US Vietnam marches in London or elsewhere in Western Europe. These are movements that come from the margins of politics. They don't come out of state structures. This is not the case in Eastern Europe. These things are organised by the state institutions, by, say, the Communist Youth or Patriotic People's Front. All these kind of state institutions do this. But I think it would be a mistake to say that it was only that. And actually this anti-imperialist idea has a resonance that goes beyond the state. So, I mean, two interesting examples. One, it was often taken up by anti-communists, people who wanted an end to the communist regime, because they could see that in the fight of Cubans against the United States, or indeed the North Vietnamese against the United States, here were people challenging a world of great power imperialisms. So just as they were fighting the Americans, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Romanians, they could take inspiration from that in their fight against the Soviets. Another interesting example I'll take from Yugoslavia, where in response to various conflicts within the developing world, you had a tradition of street violence emerge. So, for example, when Patrice Lumumba, leader of the Congo, is executed in 1961, at that point, the Yugoslav press frames this as a conspiracy between the Belgians and the US and the British and so on that led to his death. And this leads to rioting on the streets and eventually the wrecking of the Belgian embassy in the Yugoslav capital. And actually for the Yugoslav state, this is too much. The Yugoslav state actually wants to get cheap grain from the United States and doesn't want its people to express too much, too enthusiastic and anti-imperialist solidarity with these decolonizing nations, and so actually tries to clamp down on it. So there are various ways in which I think this is genuine across a variety of political persuasions.
My final question, this anti-imperialism, was it, if you like, generic anti-imperialism, or were there, turning specifically to the British Empire, was the British Empire cast in particular ways that were different from the way that, say, the French Empire was viewed?
I mean, very often the rhetoric is very general in terms. It's about Western imperialism, and British and French are often put together. Having said that, there are ways in which the experience of British Empire and decolonisation are connected with this communist world. Of course, in the interwar period, Moscow fashions itself as the world capital of anti-colonialism. Here, people struggling against empires across the world can come, find refuge, find people to discuss with, plan with, and so on. And people who will later play a prominent role in taking on British imperialism, thinking like Kenyatta or Tagore in India, these people came to Moscow. So there is this connection here. Although I would say, for the most part, in this period, say the Soviets demonize Nazi Germany much more than they do the British, I think. And indeed, the US as a rising civilization is of much more interest to them, actually, than the British Empire. Where you do find rather more of it is in, I think, the period of decolonisation itself in the late 50s. And there, all sorts of parallels are made between the socialist world and those people who are fighting for independence from the British Empire. So, for example, in my work I've done recently in Hungary, you find people writing, Hungarian communists writing about the 1956 what they would call a counter-revolution. These were people who were fighting against a communist regime for a whole variety of reasons. They get defeated, the communist regime comes back, and the communist regime says, we are just like, the people in Cyprus fighting against the British, or the people in Algeria fighting against the French. We had to fight to get Western imperialism back out of our country so we can build a progressive socialist state, just as people will do in Algeria and Cyprus. So there's an attempt to... so the British Empire is brought in the sense of, we're in a similar position to them. We're fighting imperialism wherever you find it. Just as a maybe slightly flippant final comment, there's sort of interesting representations of Harold Macmillan in the sources I've been looking at in the late 1950s. And of course, for the communists, everything is about class and the representation of class interests. The British, of course, do class terribly well, and Harold Macmillan is, a very useful caricature for them as a representative of the kind of haute bourgeoisie who, represent imperialist interests that get taken across the world. So he's often a figure of caricature in this period. And in fact, I found some wonderful documents that were parodying or ridiculing his Winds of Change speech given in Cape Town in 1960 to saying the winds of change are coming to Africa and we have to accept that African independence is coming. And he says, no, this was no real winds of change. These were winds blowing the sails of the British haute bourgeoisie into the neo-imperialist arrangements of the Commonwealth. So this idea that even though empire is falling, in fact, the British, the French, the Americans are making sure that imperialism continues throughout the world, and we, as communists, have a responsibility to support these struggles wherever they are.
James Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you.